The other thing that I can imagine that you and other people that go through what you're describing experience is regret over maybe anxiety that they've had in the past or procrastination that's led to actual consequences for their life. Do you feel regret when you think back on not applying to business school and not being able to study?
That's an interesting question. I don't feel regret on not going to business school. I don't think in the present day it would be a good decision for me for a ton of different reasons. I do regret, I guess, not having the choice. Like, it's not really like I ever had a choice to go or not go because I never got through the studying um, process. So, so simultaneously, though, part of me thinks that my mindset was especially so perfectionist that if I had had the choice, I would have just gone regardless because that's what people in my career do. You go to a top business school and like that's the next step. And I really actually don't think that would have been the right step for me. So I can spin it to myself now as like a sort of positive narrative. But I do think that it would have been nice to have the choice, even if I ultimately didn't go.
Yeah, that's a really compassionate and flexible perspective, even if you're not working to bring up that kind of flexible perspective, um, because it doesn't. I think sometimes when perfectionistic thinking is maintained, it's not just the procrastination that leads to consequences in someone's life, but then it's regret and self criticism that makes it hard to move on. So I really appreciate what you're saying, that you did have this episode where perfectionism got in the way and led to procrastination. And also you've been able to take a different route and then appreciate that growth within yourself. For those that are maybe don't see the connection as well, many people think that they're not perfectionistic because they frequently are unable to do whatever they're perfectionistic about. But perfectionism and procrastination are two sides of the same coin. And it's actually more likely that someone that's perfectionistic doesn't engage in the behavior, or if they engage in the behavior, they have to do it so perfectly that it ends up taking too long. They have diminishing returns. It gets in the way of life in some other kind of way. So that's those are markers and hallmarks of clinical perfectionism. If either you don't even attempt things that you value, or when you do things that you value, you do them so perfectly, you attempt to do them so perfectly that they have a negative consequence for your life in some other area. Does that make sense to you, Catherine?
It does, and it's funny because I didn't even realize I didn't realize until I started therapy the procrastination piece and how it ties into perfectionism. I think growing up, I assumed I had perfectionist tendencies because I did really well in school and I studied really hard and I was like fairly neurotic about how I did on tests and things like that. So I kind of understood that I had some component of perfectionism in that realm of my life. But I procrastinate literally everything. I mean, even to this day, I am always the last person to arrive at an event. I'm always like I'm regularly late for stuff, and it's funny like hearing you say that was just jogging through my mind. The like routine I go through to get ready to get out the door, and like part of putting that off because I like apply my makeup in a certain order and things like that. And so I just think that the procrastination piece, the perfectionism, is actually pretty what's the word applicable in many aspects of my life that I didn't really realize until I started understanding more about psychology.
Yeah, and some other examples before we come back to you would be in the case of contamination fear, that people assume that people with contamination OCD or contamination perfectionism um, always have a tidy and clean home. But in fact, sometimes the perfectionism is so intense that it's difficult to um, clean in a reasonable kind of way, and someone's home actually becomes dirtier. um, Other examples, so we're already using the work example, that you would assume in academics or in work that a perfectionist would have everything done really well done and totally on time and be really rigid about meeting those deadlines, but somebody that's suffering from perfectionism in a clinical way is actually more likely to be avoiding and not meeting their obligations. Or, and again, or if they start to try to not avoid, then it's really difficult to not get stuck in what they're doing. So as we think about how to shift away from perfectionistic thinking, the first step is noticing that it's happening. And so, Catherine, you did a great job just now noticing that even something like putting on makeup in a certain way is also a perfectionistic tendency. So the first step is to notice. And then the next step is to work to have a more flexible attitude so that you can have more flexible behavior. So in your case, how would you need to shift your attitude or your mindset to make it so that you're more likely to be on time for events?
Ooh. Um, that's a loaded question because I am so often late for things. I think trying to think through ways that I don't need to look a certain way when I go out the door. But it's interesting because it's not really even how I look. It's more like the process.
Mm-hmm. That you want to feel a certain way?
Yeah, like I like to do the process in in a certain order, and it really does like drive me nuts when I only get like a certain way through the process, and my boyfriend is like, "Come on, we have to go." And I'm like, "Nope," but I'm on step 4, and I have like 6 more steps to go through to finish the getting ready process.
When you say it drives you nuts, can you be more specific about how that feels? Like what you think and feel if you are if your whole routine is disrupted?
It feels incomplete. Like it feels like I had a process set out and I didn't finish it. It feels like I didn't accomplish something in like a really micro example.
So it sounds like it's uncomfortable for its own sake. It's not necessarily like I'm going to be judged by how I look or my self-worth is tied to a certain kind of outcome of how I look or what how I'm behaving. It's more that this just feels uncomfortable for its own sake and it's aversive to you for its own sake.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for using that example. That's completely an area of perfectionism that's very common. Um, how does it feel to recognize that that's happening for you?
It's interesting because I've actually never really thought about it until this call right now.
And what would it mean for your life to try to be more flexible around that routine?
um, Honestly, it would actually probably improve a lot of relationships because I would be more likely to show up on time to things, I think. And I am well known as the friend who does not show up on time. My friends have made an entire game, like an over under game, around the time that Catherine shows up to events.
Got it. And even though that game might seem funny and silly, you can actually see that it probably has an impact on your relationships.
Yeah, people are definitely irritated when I show up late.
Okay. So does that make it worth it to be uncomfortable and to tolerate, to like let yourself habituate to stopping your routine midway, um, and then letting yourself be uncomfortable about what you didn't do?
Yeah, I think that would be definitely a worthy thing for me to try to adapt to for sure.